Good evening and welcome to a very special Easter Sunday history show with a live audience at the National Library of Ireland here in Dublin city centre. We're marking the 100th edition of the online newspaper Century Ireland, which looks at events in this country a century ago. Over the next hour, we'll be reflecting on Ireland in 1917. We'll have music from that year brought to life by Andy Irvine and Kate O'Callaghan. Poet Dermot Bolger will recall a poignant moment from 1917. Actor Barry McGovern will recite a poem from Francis Ledwidge, who died that year. And our distinguished panel will be assessing the state of Ireland, this time 100 years ago, a year on from the Easter Rising. On that panel is Galway historian Gearóid Ó Tuathaigh, Belfast playwright and historian Philip Orr, Katherine McSharry from the National Library and Mark Duncan from Century Ireland. But to get things started, we asked Andy Irvine to take a look at Irish songs written in 1917 and unearthed by archivist Terry Moylan. But first, Gearóid Ó Tuathaigh, perhaps you might introduce this song for us. It's called That's the Stuff to Give 'Em.
Well, it's in the line of English music hall war songs, goes back to the jingo songs from the 1870s. And essentially it's a rallying one about stuffing it into the enemy. That's what it amounts to. Except that in this instance, of course, it's turned right around, so that it's essentially a nationalist, an up Sinn Fein song, with all of the rhetoric and all of the jingles and all of the heavy stuff that was in the music hall tradition, the English music hall tradition of war jingo songs, except turned right around against the British and given a Sinn Féin idiom.
Which gives it an added piquancy, I think, for our audience. Now, bear in mind that this probably hasn't been heard or sung for the guts of the last 100 years, but off you go with That's the Stuff to Give 'Em, Andy Irvine. Right, I think we can say with absolute certainty Fred Carno would not have approved. That was Andy Irvine with That's the Stuff to Give 'Em, a music hall song written in 1917 by Harry Freeman and George Grant and contained in Terry Moylan's recent compendium, The Indignant Muse, which is an absolutely fascinating book for anybody who's interested in the music of this period. OK, turning to our panel, Gearóid Ó Tuathaigh, we already heard from. We're going to wind the clock back 100 years to 1917. So just cast your eyes across the Irish Sea to London and how the political complexion was changing there. What was going on?
Well, Lloyd George had replaced Asquith since Christmas of 1916. And that was a decisive shift because Lloyd George was now Prime Minister of a largely Conservative government. Not only had he replaced Asquith as Prime Minister, but he had in fact restructured the whole structure of government to make it a war cabinet, to go for efficiency and success, where there had been a great deal missing in both, as it were, for the previous 2 years. The other thing is that Lloyd George's arrival on the scene meant that he had form, so to speak, in dealing with the Irish situation. So that when Lloyd George comes in, first of all, the remaining prisoners in Frongoch get out for Christmas in 2016. But Lloyd George wants to keep Home Rule off the agenda for the moment. He has a huge plate in the war effort. Huge plate in terms of working out efficiencies, munitions, food supplies, the sea. Because, of course, in February of 1917, the Germans announced the unrestricted submarine bombing, so that the war effort itself intensifies. There's a totally changed political complexion in London. Home Rule is not top of the agenda. Lloyd George having already failed in the summer of 1916 to find a solution. It was a matter of kicking it down the road as much as possible or keeping it off the agenda until the war effort was done. So Ireland was not top of the agenda in the start of 1917, but of course in Ireland things were changing and changing fairly decisively.
Mark, the releases of prisoners, what significance did those releases have? What difference did they make? All of these now Sinn Féin prisoners, even though some of them might never have been members of Sinn Féin, coming back to Ireland.
The prisoners are coming home to an increasingly warm reception. There's an awful lot more sympathy for them, but there's also a great interest in the Rising itself, and it's kind of apparent in the demand for those instant histories, the souvenir brochures around the Rising. It's apparent too in the increased visibility of Republican paraphernalia, flags, rosettes, badges. They're more conspicuous in terms
of songs.
And songs, absolutely.
Now, also in 1917, Gearóid, by-elections. There were key by-elections, and they showed the rising strength of Sinn Féin.
They did, and they contributed to that rising strength because even though sentiment had shifted after the rising and continued to shift, and the Irish Parliamentary Party was in a drift, essentially not able to take any initiative very much, what was required was to turn that sentiment into something more cohesive as a political force, and that didn't happen overnight either. But the by-elections were critical, the North West Common one in February, and then, of course, coming after that, South Longford, and then East Clare with De Valera in the summer, and immediately afterwards in August, W.T. Cosgrave in Kilkenny City. And I think what's important about the by-elections is that the kind of sentiment and the emergence of cohorts of new politicised people on the ground organisationally, some of them ex-prisoners. But they had hard work to do, Myles, because remember, this is the old electorate. This is the old register. The new voting system doesn't come until 1918. We're not talking about a mass electorate. This is the same electorate.
Who have been returning the Irish Parliamentary Party for generations.
Who had, even though they're depleted, obviously, because of the long interval of the war. But that said, what you get is that Sinn Fein becomes the flag of convenience for what was a fairly splintered separatist or more advanced nationalist presence. The Irish Nation League, Count Plunkett, who famously won the Roscommon one in the worst weather in living memory in February of 1917. His Liberty clubs. There was a lot of fragmentation, but it was becoming more cohesive organisationally, and the sentiment of sympathy with Sinn Féin was beginning to congeal into an organisational framework, and in that, the by-elections were an instrument of it, as well as Sinn Féin being a beneficiary of it.
And is this why Lloyd George responds with the Irish Convention? Because he realises that Sinn Féin, that advanced nationalists are getting ahead of steam, and that he must try and bring in from now the sidelines the Irish Parliamentary Party.
Well, certainly by May he is coming under
Just explain
pressure.
What the Irish Convention was, perhaps.
Lloyd George had in fact already given a further slap in the face to the Irish Parliamentary Party when in March of 1917 he made that famous statement that, speaking of partition, that sentiment among Ulster Unionists was so different to the rest of the island, and that they were in this matter of sentiment and feeling of Britishness closer to Fife and Aberdeen. And it was a serious rebuff to the Irish Parliamentary Party. But what he did suggest then in May was either that there could be an attempt to relaunch a Home Rule scheme with partition, a Home Rule settlement, which had already failed the summer before, or essentially hand it over to the Irish. In other words, have an assembly, a convention, in which all of the Irish parties would be invited. Not just the political parties, but leaders of society, clergy, independents, leaders of civic society, some local government figures. And it eventually ended up with an assembly that got off the ground, if we can call it that, in July of 1917, with about 95. But in fact, Sinn Féin boycotted it. That was the first thing. And remember, the month before, in June, the remaining prisoners, the diehards who had been in jail in Lewis prison, about 120, the last to be released, and those who had actually been sentenced, including De Valera and Noel McNeill and others, they arrived back to a huge reception in June of 1917. The worst possible, if you like, atmosphere within which Lloyd George's convention should gather. And the convention simply talked itself away. Not, it must be said, in any shameful way. On the contrary, there were some excellent rapport established between some of the southern unionists, for example, in Redmond, but it was going nowhere. Sinn Féin would not participate in it. There was continuing difficulties about the degree of fiscal autonomy or what kind of taxing powers an Irish Assembly might have. And of course, the ultimate rock was the Ulster Unionists would not budge on permanent exclusion. Partition was non-negotiable at that stage.
OK, well, let's talk briefly to Philip Orr. We're going to be talking to Philip about the key First World War battles from an Irish perspective a little bit later in the programme. But just talk about the perspective of Northern Unionists on the changed political sentiment in what is now the Republic of Ireland in the south, in the 26 counties, although those were terms that obviously didn't exist at the time.
It's interesting if you look at, say, the Belfast newsletter, which is very much an organ of Northern Unionism, as the by-election results unfold, a sense of horror, I think, at what's actually happening. But one of the interesting things for me is when you look at some of the comments in that newsletter, when they see the reactions that have taken place from Irish parliamentary party leaders like John Dillon, they talk about in the editorial, there's a sneaking sympathy clearly with the rising going on here inside constitutional nationalism. And I think one of the fallouts is I've read places where the honesty of Sinn Fein is congratulated. Actually, at least you know where you are with Sinn Fein, whereas the Irish Parliamentary Party say they're for the war, but in actuality it's clear they're sneaking sympathy with the rebels and they oppose conscription. And I get the impression that in some unionist circles there's this feeling that maybe conscription will do the job. If we can only get everybody into the army, that'll tighten things up, that'll sort out the situation.
And Gearóid, can it be said at some point in 1916 that Sinn Féin's massive victory the following year is starting to look inevitable?
Not inevitable, but certainly...
Because they did lose. I mean, Sinn Féin did lose three.
Yes, they did.
Yeah,
it depended on... And by-elections happen in very particular constituencies. And they were lucky, in a sense, in the ones that they did. Clare and Roscommon were two of the most disturbed counties in Ireland. Sinn Féin majority in Kilkenny was pretty well anticipated before Cosgrave's victory. So that it's not inevitable. You can't extrapolate from the by-elections only. But RIC reports the lamentations of the Irish Parliamentary Party, the clear evidence on the ground that organisationally the party is becoming sclerotic or has become sclerotic and essentially is getting overrun by a new machine. All of these things are portents, as it were, but it's not inevitable. There still is a great deal to play for, and I suppose it really only becomes more likely when Sinn Féin restructures itself in October of 1917. The Ard Fheis, and followed immediately afterwards by De Valera's election as president of the Volunteers, gives that cohesiveness and brings together under the brand of Sinn Féin, as it were, those who had been more militarily inclined and who were more active in the Volunteers, and those who were politically becoming more and more content and occupied in what would be regular politics as distinct from other things, and the new cohort that Michael Collins is in these. And the signs are there all the time. The funeral to Moss Ash, for example, in September of 1917.
Who died on hunger strike.
The huge surge of emotion in it and the sheer presence of it. The signs are there that a very ominous wave is about to overtake the Irish Parliamentary Party, and Redmond's own indifferent health and melancholy, I think it would be not too strong a word for it, begins to show very, very clearly.
Just to pick up on the point of good fortune, the Sinn Féin were absolutely fortunate that by-elections fell where they did in 1917. There hadn't been a general election since 1910. There hadn't been a contested election in some of these constituencies for well over 20 years, and Clare, I think, is an example of that, you know. And what's striking also on the ground is just the level of energy and activity. Sinn Féin are clearly attracting young men in their 20s and 30s. The use of the cars are really important. Motor cars are being used to ferry not only the candidates but canvassers around the county. They're also being used on election day to take people to the polling stations and back again. Really solid political organisations. They really
just... are getting endowments of petrol. They're getting the people for petrol organisationally. And women. Women having the vote, but the activities of women in the prisoners' aid thing, first of all, and afterwards in the local area. Women are being constantly identified by the RIC in their reports as being especially active among the Sinn Féin.
But there are no nuns being ferried to the polling stations in 1917.
No, but it does go hand in hand with the increase in the number of Sinn Féin clubs and branches being formed throughout 1917.
I think it's important to say also that a Redmondite stronghold is West Belfast, is Belfast, in fact. Joe Devlin is very much the king of the Falls Road, and this is a Redmondite seat. You know, one of the big worries for that community in 1917, as partition comes more and more to the fore, is that going to be permanent or is that going to be temporary? Now, if you're a nationalist living in Fermanagh or, you know, the far southwestern reaches of Ulster, you think there's every possibility that if, some kind of final settlement takes place, you might find your way into an Irish independent polity or what becomes eventually the Irish Free State. If you're stuck in Belfast, in which there is a huge unionist majority, chances are, one way or another, you're going to really be stuck.
Stay with us. You're listening to a History Show special coming from the National Library. We're talking about 1917. When we return, the actor Barry McGovern will be reading for us an extraordinary 1917 poem by the Meath poet Francis Ledwidge. Welcome back to the National Library of Ireland and a very special Easter Sunday history show marking the 100th edition of the online newspaper Century Ireland. We're in the company of a live audience of musicians Andy Irvine as well as Kate O'Callaghan and friends, and a distinguished panel of guests assessing the state of Ireland this time 100 years ago, a year on from the Easter Rising. Historian Gearóid Ó Tuathaigh, playwright Philip Orr, Katherine McSharry from the National Library and Mark Duncan from Century Ireland are our guests. Katherine McSharry has been taking a look at the arts in Ireland in 1917. So what significant work was underway a century ago?
So one of the most significant moments in Irish culture was happening not in Ireland but in Zurich. James Joyce and his family were in Zurich, and of course they were there because of the war. They'd had to leave Trieste where they'd been living, and it's in Zurich that Joyce is writing to his friend Constantine Curran and telling him, because Joyce is the patron saint of everyone who thought they'd get things done before they actually did, that he'd be finished Ulysses in 1918. He doesn't actually finish it until 1922, but he is writing some of the episodes of Ulysses. In particular, from our point of view here at the National Library, he's writing the earliest draft of Proteus, the third chapter of Ulysses, which survives, and which, of course, interestingly, is often the chapter where people break down in despair and don't continue on to read the rest of the book.
And in relation to the visual arts, William Orpin from Stillorgan in Dublin has been given the official title, official war artist. One of a couple. Lavery was in a similar boat, if you like. So he's actually on the Western Front in 1917, painting some quite extraordinary pictures.
Yes, so Orpin's images of the war are some of the most striking and extraordinary imagery you can imagine. He writes back in July of 1917 of, quite casually, he talks about painting bones, skeletons. He's at the battlefield of where the Somme had been fought, and he's almost approaching it in this very casual manner, and then suddenly he says a great gust of wind comes up, and I didn't know if I was lonely or afraid. And there's something in that phrase that conveys the heightened realism and the horror of a lot of those paintings that he produces, not all of which you would feel, and thinking about something like Dead Germans in a Trench, would have served the propaganda purpose that they were intended to meet, but which do give us a really powerful sense of what it was like to be there. OK, you've told us what Joyce was up to in 1970. What about the other fella, W.B. Yeats? What was he doing? Yeats was after the women, as always. So at the beginning of 1917, Yeats is finishing The Wild Swans at Coole. And that's a really interesting poem because it has this sense of elegy, of something ending, and of something else beginning. And it also has in it the lines that we see in Easter 1916. He says, all's changed. So this sense of everything changing that we've already talked about is very strongly there in Yeats. And in that year, he realises he's never going to marry Maud Gonne, which most of the rest of us already knew. He proposes to her daughter, Iseult, and is rejected. And in the autumn, he marries George Hyde-Lees, who is much younger than him. In a very distressed emotional state, actually, that wedding takes place. And the future course of their married life looks very uncertain until George discovers in herself this ability to do automatic writing, to hear and
Wasn't that convenient?
I suppose the psychological requirements that all marriages need are something that George worked out. And he together started to record her voices that she heard from the spirit world. And it was, again, interestingly, this source of renewed energy and vigour very much for Yeats, is this new way that he was interacting with George and that they were working together to put together a spiritual system.
What about this building? What was going on in the National Library in 1917?
So the National Library in 1917 is a fascinating place. On the one hand, it's haunted by ghosts. So Francis Sheehy Skeffington would have stood on the steps outside. Thomas McDonough was a regular user of the reading room. It's haunted by the ghosts of those who died in 1916, but it's also always incredibly vibrant and busy and bustling, because the students from UCD, who at the time were on Stephen's Green, all used to come down here to the National Library. And one of those students was the novelist Kate O'Brien, who was a scholarship girl in UCD at the time. And she writes incredibly evocatively of the time that she spent in Dublin. She says it was still smoking from the Easter Rising, she says. She says they were dirty and hungry, we lot of 1917, but we were wild and we were free. And when she talks about the National Library, she talks about it with extraordinary affection, and she remembers key moments. She says, like, generations remember Father Dineen, who famously wrote the dictionary and his messy bags of food. She says, over there is where someone pointed out De Valera to me standing by the Irish dictionaries, wearing incredibly ugly black gaiters, the most unlikely hero you ever saw.
What about that relatively new art form, film?
Yeah, so film is starting to become this really popular and, for that reason, therefore, source of anxiety, of social anxiety and form. And actually, Kate O'Brien talks about leaving the National Library and going off to the Grafton Picture House. And so increasingly...
Inducing moral panic in society, basically.
Yeah, exactly. So you get, for example, there's Ireland a Nation, a pretty bad film that's made in 1914, is shown in January of 1917 and only gets 2 showings before the military authorities decide it's causing too much dissent. But you also have the beginnings of censorship, which began in 1916, and in January of 1917 as well, you have lady inspectors being appointed to go round to the picture houses and make sure the nation's morals aren't in decline.
OK, let's move to poetry, because 1917 was the year that the Meath poet Francis Ledwidge was killed in the First World War on the 31st of July 1917. And Ledwidge was a founder of the Slane branch of the Irish Volunteers. He was a labour activist. He was a friend of the executed rising leader Thomas McDonough. And at the outbreak of the First World War, he had established himself as a respected writer and a respected poet. And despite initial opposition, he signed up and went to Gallipoli in 1915, continued to write throughout the war in often atrocious conditions, growing increasingly cynical about the war, especially in the aftermath of the Easter Rising. And the acclaimed actor Barry McGovern will recite one of Ledwidge's poems, one of the poems most associated with the war. There weren't that many of them, and this is called Soliloquy. Katherine, would you just say a couple of words about it perhaps in advance?
So I think this is a poem that tells us what Ledwidge might have become, and it gives us in its final line some of the power of the poem really derives from that, and it's very much worth hearing the poem all the way to the end because the original audience didn't. OK, well, we'll actually hear it in its original incarnation as published first, and then we will hear it as he actually wrote it, because they are 2 rather different things. So Barry McGovern reading Soliloquy by Francis Ledwidge.
When I was young, I had a care lest I should cheat me of my share of that which makes it sweet to strive for life, and dying still survive, a name in sunshine written higher than lark or poet dare aspire. But I grew weary doing well. Besides, 'twas sweeter in that hell, down with the loud banditti people who robbed the orchards, climbed the steeple for jackdaws' eggs, and made the cock crow ere 'twas daylight on the clock. I was so very bad, the neighbours spoke of me at their daily labours. And now I'm drinking wine in France, the helpless child of circumstance. Tomorrow will be loud with war. How will I be accounted for? It is too late now to retrieve a fallen dream, too late to grieve a name unmade, but not too late to thank the gods for what is great. A keen-edged sword, a soldier's heart, is greater than a poet's art. And greater than a poet's fame, a little grave that has no name.
Now, that was Soliloquy written by Francis Ledwidge during the First World War, before his death in July 1917, on the first day of the Third Battle of Ypres. And that's how it was published, so that's how people read it for the first time. That's not how he wrote it, because there is a last line which was deleted by we know not who. So I'm just going to ask Barry if you would mind reading the last verse as it was originally written by Francis Ledwidge.
It is too late now to retrieve a fallen dream, too late to grieve a name unmade, but not too late to thank the gods for what is great. A keen-edged sword, a soldier's heart, is greater than a poet's art, and greater than a poet's fame, a little grave that has no name, whence honour turns away in shame.
Katherine, how does the insertion of that, or the inclusion rather than the insertion of that last line, change the meaning of the poem?
So that last stanza, without that last line, collapses into a very conventional, pious patriotism. The little grave that bears no name, that sense of honour, and the honour of the soldier's life is more significant than the poet's art. And it has a rhyme scheme that the final line breaks open. So you have these series of rhyming couplets, and then suddenly you have this last line, whence honour turns away in shame. And what the form does, that extra line, is it shows us that sentiment is not meant to be there. That sentiment, like the line in the rhyming scheme, is not meant to be there. And that sentiment is of complete disillusionment with the cause in which Ledwidge is fighting, with the army uniform that he's wearing, and even calling into question his own poetic endeavour. It is a deeply, deeply moving and terrible end.
And the assumption being that the line was deleted by his patron, Lord Dunsany, who was editing the collections and who was a captain in the Inniskilling Fusiliers. That's the assumption. It may not be the case.
Somewhere, whether it was Dunsany or whether it was in the publishing house, that line disappears. And it's so much more, it's conventionally useful propaganda without it, and it is deeply unsettling and unconventional with it.
Philip Orr, from an Irish perspective, Barry McGovern, thank you, by the way, very much indeed for that wonderful rendition of an amazing poem by Francis Ledwidge, one of his great poems. From an Irish perspective, what is the key moment of the First World War in 1917?
Well, the key moment, I guess, is the Battle of Messines, which is a kind of prelude then to the bigger engagement, Third Ypres, because the two main Irish infantry divisions, the 16th, mainly nationalist in ethos, 36th with a strong unionist ethos, have lost very heavily at the Battle of the Somme, between 9,000 and 10,000 casualties between them. And they're moved north to Flanders, where Haig is planning, another go at breaking through the German defences there. They are going to be with General Plumer's Second Army, a very meticulously well-organised army. And their task is, in particular, to help with the other divisions who were there to take the Messines Ridge, which is a very extensive bit of relative high ground with a lot of strategic importance. And the battle then takes place. It's a very short battle. There's a bit of mopping up afterwards, but it's primarily on the 7th of June. And it's a battle with a strong technical element to it. Mines go off, huge mines, probably the biggest man-made explosion until we get to the atom bombs in 1945. A lot of tanks, a lot of aerial involvement, artillery much more efficient than it was. And in many ways, the evolution gradually happening of what we call the platoon. The long lines of men at the Somme, a very poor way of conducting a modern battle. So power and decision-making devolved down to a small group of men with an officer in charge. The 36th and 16th fight literally together as part of the corps that they're in to take the village of Whitesheeta in Flanders. They are literally side by side. I suppose in some ways it's a fulfillment of the Redmondite dream, that, as John Redmond hoped, in battle, men could put on one side their differences at home in pursuit of a common cause of liberty and freedom, tackling the Hun, as it might have been called. And, of course, an epitome of that in a tragic sense is that John Redmond's brother, Major Willie Redmond, loses his life in that battle and is brought in from the battlefield by a stretcher-bearer from the Ulster Division, John Meek, former UVF man. And in many ways, that story became a very edifying story, one that is rehearsed frequently in community circles in the North today, about the ability of Unionists and Nationalists to fight side by side and care for one another. Now, the reality, very different. I think at the officer level, Redmond is a member of the House of Parliament, the Gentlemen's Club, so the officers on both sides, 36th and 16th, probably get along reasonably well when they have to occasionally meet. But the ordinary soldier on either side in the division, I very much doubt it. And of course, the significant thing at the tail end of the battle and the death of Redmond is that the by-election that happens in East Clare brings Eamon de Valera through with a triumphant victory. So, we are already seeing the storms of change happening here back home.
Philip, thank you very much indeed. Now, to end this part of the programme, we're going to hear a column from poet Dermot Bolger, who's been reflecting on a particularly poignant moment Ireland in 1917. That was the death of Muriel McDonough, one of the famous Gifford sisters and widow of Thomas McDonough.
In the public imagination, the Easter Rising's last casualty was James Connolly, executed on May 12th, 1916. This ignores the fate of 8-year-old Walter Scott, who suffered a random gunshot wound when innocently walking in East Wall during the Rising, and died in Mercer's Hospital on July 5th after history's gaze had moved on. But perhaps the last casualty of that insurrection was a distraught young widow who, on July the 9th, 1917, entered the waves on Skerries Beach in North Dublin and swam away from the shore. There are different versions of what occurred, but as Maud Gunn McBride wrote in a letter, Muriel McDonough, widow of the executed poet Thomas McDonough, swam out to sea towards Howth and never returned. She was such a lovely girl. Muriel was in Skerries with her 4-year-old daughter Barbara and other widows and children of the executed leaders to try to enjoy the temporary respite of a holiday in a house rented with funds raised by supporters. If ever a group of women needed collective support, it was these widows. 2 or possibly 3 were pregnant when their husbands were shot, and at least 1 miscarried soon afterwards. Muriel had strong political beliefs, but was among the least militant-minded of those forlorn holiday makers. She was also perhaps the least politically radical of the independent-minded Gifford sisters. These included her younger sister, Grace, whose marriage in Kilmainham jail to Joseph Murray Plunkett, hours before his execution, was already the stuff of folklore by 1917. Grace was with Muriel in Skerries that day, but it must have seemed a long way from their childhood holidays when their prosperous parents decamped to the seaside each summer with a bevy of servants from their house in Rathmines. Their father was an affluent Catholic solicitor. Their mother, the dominant force at home, was resolutely Protestant, rigidly respectable and unionist. All 12 Gifford children were raised as Protestants. The 6 sons retained their parents' unionist beliefs and led unremarkable lives. In contrast, all 6 daughters rebelled and, to varying degrees, embraced radical ideals connected with nationalism and rights for workers and women. Grace remains immortalized in song, but people rarely remember Muriel, the sister Thomas McDonough fell in love with. Being a mixed marriage, their wedding was a quiet affair in 1912. A son, Donagh, was born, who later became a fine poet himself. A daughter followed a year later. Although involved with the Women's Franchise League, Muriel was more delicate and domesticated than her sisters, prone to suffer with her nerves. The Rising swept away everything she possessed. British soldiers callously machine-gunned her house to render it uninhabitable. She was prevented from reaching her husband before his execution. She rented a flat in which to raise her children, spurning her mother's financial help when that woman bad-mouthed Thomas McDonough for leaving his young family penniless. More tragedy occurred when 5-year-old Donagh fell down several flights of steps in a Dublin shop in early 1917, suffering injuries that required long-term care in Temple Street Hospital. Muriel was reluctant to go to Skerries without her son, and wrote to Donagh every day in hospital. Nobody knows her intentions on that day when she left her daughter happily collecting shells on the beach. A popular story was that she died swimming beyond her depth, determined to plant a tricolour on an island in Skerries Bay. Perhaps this grieving woman simply could not cope any longer, or more likely her heart simply seized up from exhaustion. 1917 is remembered for the funeral of Thomas Ashe, who died after being force-fed on hunger strike. As an Easter week commander, he could be called the Rising's last casualty, but his death in reality was the opening salvo of the War of Independence. Dubliners had been denied any chance to attend the hasty burials of the 1916 leaders. By 1917, they wanted to pay their respects. but nobody in the massive crowd that walked in the funeral of Muriel McDonough, a cortege viewed by her son from a window in Temple Street Hospital, would have wanted the chance to show the respect to come in such a manner, by following the coffin of a widow who was, in many respects, the Rising's last casualty, a young mother left alone, whose grieving heart simply gave out.
Poet Dermot Bolger with that reflection on the death in 1917 of Muriel McDonough. We'll take a break. Welcome back to the National Library of Ireland and a very special Easter Sunday history show marking the 100th edition of the online newspaper Century Ireland. We're in the company of a live audience of musicians Andy Irvine as well as Kate O'Callaghan and friends, and a distinguished panel of guests assessing the state of Ireland this time 100 years ago, a year on from the Easter Rising. Historian Gearóid Ó Tuathaigh, playwright Philip Orr, Katherine McSharry from the National Library and Mark Duncan from Century Ireland are our guests. Of course, there was life, Mark, in 1917 beyond politics, beyond revolution, beyond war. Tell us something about employment, tell us something about social conditions in 1917.
Well, I think it's important to bear in mind that notwithstanding the war and notwithstanding the turbulent political situation, there were solid grounds for social unease and political unrest anyway. The Irish economy and society had been effectively reshaped by the war. And while some people are doing very well out of it, there's large-scale employment in the industries and the factories of the industrialised northeast. Farmers are doing very well indeed. They're getting high prices for their foodstuffs, albeit they're under huge pressure to switch towards tillage, and not without some success. In a county like Meath in 1917, from 1916 to 1917, there are 20,000 more acres were producing oats. There are 12,000 acres producing potatoes, where there were only 8,000 the year before. So they're enjoying some success. The problem really is for those on low and fixed incomes. By February 1917, the price of foodstuffs are nearly 190% dearer than they had been in August 1914. So if you're on a low, as I said, or a fixed income, that's really kind of striking at your standard of living. And you see this reflected in the amount of industrial unrest. Just to take a few weeks in February, March of 1914, if you kind of surveyed the newspapers, what will you find? You will find that the teachers are coming together to hold their annual congress, demanding a wage rise that they feel they've been prevented since the turn of the century. You will find farm labourers joining unions in ever-increasing numbers. Down in Cork, there are 400 carpenters out on strike. In neighbouring Kerry, in the town of Tralee, there are workers locked out of their business for non-payment of a war bonus, a dispute arising over the non-payment of a war bonus. So these are all based around wage demands rooted in the circumstances of war and the rising cost of living. And to be fair, at Dublin Council level, they understand that the wages are absolutely inadequate. You take somewhere like the railways, where there had been a dispute in late 1916. The government effectively comes in and takes over the railways. Most of the workers benefit there from a war bonus, and that galvanises trade union membership among railway workers. And indeed, trade union membership, which looked like it was going to hit the floor after the lockout in 1913, skyrockets during those war years. So it's really important.
What about sporting life? What impact has the First World War had on sport in Ireland?
Well, I was really struck by Catherine's remark there about Kate O'Brien talking about being wild and free in Dublin in 1917. It's a reminder that everyday life does go on despite the difficult circumstances. War has an immediate impact on sport. The sporting world effectively contracts in Ireland as a result of the war. Some sporting organisations just bring their games to an abrupt stop, like rugby. An organisation like the GAA tries to maintain a semblance or normality in abnormal circumstances, but their difficulties become more acute in the wake of the Rising, because there are more restrictions now on excursion trains. It means that games are delayed. It means that attendances decline. The All-Ireland hurling final of 1916 is actually not played until January 1917, and it's played in front of only 5,000 people. You're getting 20,000, 25,000 people at games just on the eve of the First World War. There are 3,000 at the All-Ireland football final, which is played in miserable conditions in December 1916. So the opportunities for sport are much more limited than they had been.
Another major change in world history in 1917 was provided by Russia's two revolutions, which we've looked at elsewhere on the History Show this year. But Fionnuala Walsh of Trinity College has been looking at the impact in Ireland of the Russian revolutions.
We acclaim the Russian Revolution, and our hearts respond to the call of the Russian people to join with the workers throughout war-stricken Europe in dethroning imperialism and capitalism in our respective countries. That was Thomas Johnson, writing in the Voice of Labour journal in February 1918. That month, an estimated 10,000 people gathered at the Mansion House in Dublin to demonstrate their support for the Russian Revolution. The Irish socialist press greeted the outbreak of revolution in Russia with great enthusiasm, while the nationalist paper New Ireland described the Bolshevik government as not only the finest, most decisive and most efficient government which Russia has known, but the most representative government which any European nation had seen for many a long day. Irish Republicans were inspired by the Russian Revolution and welcomed the support of the Bolsheviks for Ireland's independence struggle. For example, Vladimir Lenin had referred to the Easter Rising in his own writings, describing it as a decisive blow against the power of English imperialism. The years 1917 and 1918 witnessed a huge growth in the trade union movement in Ireland, which was partly influenced by the events in Russia. The Irish Trade Union Congress sent congratulations to the Workers' Council in 1917 and praised them for having won for Labour one of the greatest victories in the world's history. The class and Republican struggles were intertwined with the socialist element of concern to the British administration and to the Unionist press. The Irish Times referred to the infection of Ireland by the anarchy of Bolshevism after the February 1918 meeting, while Lord John French, Lord Lieutenant to Ireland, was informed on his arrival in 1918 that Bolshevism was in the air and that there was a strong Leninist element in Sinn Fein. Strikers began to adopt the term Soviet for their occupations of workplaces. Ireland witnessed over 100 of these occupations in 1919 and 1920. The first of many groups to self-consciously adopt the term Soviet were the staff of the Monaghan Asylum in January 1919. In protest at their low wages, the workers seized the asylum, locked out the governor and barricaded all the entrances. They elected a new governor, flew a red flag over the building and managed the asylum themselves for 12 days until management gave in to their pay demands. The most well-known of these workplace occupations was the Limerick Soviet in April 1919. The workers in Limerick went on general strike in protest at the actions of the British military against the IRA in Limerick. The Trades Council took over the running of the city and declared it a Soviet. They organised food supply and even printed their own money. The Limerick Soviet lasted 2 weeks. These occupations and the use of the term Soviet revealed the lasting impact of the Russian Revolution in Ireland.
Fionnuala Walsh, Irish Research Council postdoctoral fellow at Trinity College, on the impact of Russia's revolutions here in Ireland in 1917 and beyond. That's it from the National Library here in Kildare Street, where we've been celebrating the 100th edition of the online historical newspaper Century Ireland, which is published every fortnight on rte.ie/Century Ireland. Thanks to our audience for joining us today. Thanks to my guests, Gearóid Ó Tuathaigh, Katherine McSharry, Philip Orr, Mark Duncan, Barry McGovern, Andy Irvin. And also thanks to the Director of the National Library, Sandra Collins, and to the National Library staff for all their help today as well. Also, thanks on sound to Mick McLaughlin and Donny Stritch, and to Lisa McGill, who is the broadcasting coordinator. To play us out this evening, Kate O'Callaghan, Seamus Devaney and Tim Jarvis are going to perform a song that in 1917 was recorded by John McCormick, Keep the Home Fires Burning. From me, Myles Dungan, and producer Alan Torney, goodbye and thanks for listening.